The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
A warm welcome to Squawk Box with Karen Cho, myself, Steve Sedgwick, and these are your headlines. Israel shatters the ceasefire, launching airstrikes on dozens of targets in Gaza, reportedly killing more than 200 people and threatening more to come. US retail sales rise less than expected, added to concerns about the state of the US consumer, as the OECD warns of slowing global growth.
There's a very significant level of uncertainty right now, and it is clear that the global economy would benefit from increases in certainty when it comes to the trade policy settings.
Germany's Bundestag is expected to shake off the country's fiscal shackles today and overhaul its debt brake laws, lifting the cap on defence spending and greenlighting €500 billion in infrastructure investment. BYD unveils a potential game changer, rolling out new tech it claims can charge EVs in just 5 minutes.
Israel said it had carried out extensive strikes on Hamas targets in Gaza, the heaviest on the enclave since a ceasefire deal was reached in January. Palestinian health authorities say at least 200 people have been killed, whilst Hamas says Israel has ended the ceasefire agreement with that attack. Well, Dan joins us from the Middle East now with more. And Dan, the key question, I guess, to start off with that everyone wants to know is why? Why now?
Well, that's right, Steve. And we are, of course, following these headlines as they continue to develop. But it would appear that ceasefire in Gaza collapsed earlier today. Israeli airstrikes pounding targets across the Gaza Strip. And as you say, killing at least 200 people. That's according to Palestinian health officials. Many of the victims, we understand, are reported to be children. But of course, details are still emerging. The Israeli military also saying that it has hit dozens of those Hamas-linked sites, and also warning here that its operations will continue, and I quote here, for as long as necessary. And this also comes after weeks of stalled ceasefire talks. Of course, over the last few weeks, we have seen Israel accusing Hamas of refusing to release those remaining hostages. And of course, Hamas in turn also blaming Israel for violating the truce and also insisting on a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. At the same time, what we've seen is mediators from the US, Egypt and Qatar working hard in this part of the world to try and extend that ceasefire. But negotiations have seemingly stalled as well. And there's now a chance that this renewed violence threatens what is a wider escalation as well. Also, wanted to update you on some fresh commentary that we've heard from Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon, saying on X that the UN Security Council will also be meeting today to discuss this. And he says Israel is going to make it very clear to the council that it needs to ensure the return of those Israeli hostages if it wants to end the war. He said, I quote here, Israel will not stop until all of our hostages are back home. But of course, also remember, Hamas was working to an originally agreed timeline here set up by the US, who has seemingly, under the Trump administration, shifted the goalposts on this. So as we watch these headlines continue to develop, as the numbers continue to evolve, we'll keep you updated on the situation in the region. But just to repeat that developing news, it would appear that the ceasefire in Gaza has now collapsed. Back over to you.
And that's incredibly disturbing news. Dan, thank you very much indeed for bringing it to us. I know we'll see you a little bit later on in the programme. US President Donald Trump will speak with Russian President Vladimir Putin today amid his push to end the war in Ukraine, although Moscow has concerns with the proposed ceasefire agreement. Trump said the leaders will discuss, and this is quite disturbing for, I guess, Europeans and especially for Ukrainians, leaders will discuss dividing up certain assets, including land and power plants. Karen, the markets.
Well, let's take a look at what we saw stateside yesterday. A bit of green moving back onto the charts. 0.8 up for the Dow. The S&P 500 also moving modestly firmer, and the Nasdaq trailing behind the other major boards, but still positive. If you look at the impact of some of the major stock plays yesterday, a lot of reading through into the narrative here around Berkshire Hathaway increasing its exposure to Japanese trading houses. Don't forget, this company has been building up a stockpile, and as the markets have been selling off to get some news flow, that it is repositioning in certain assets, but Japanese assets, I think that is fascinating. The other point here was that Nvidia still very, very cautious coming up to another update from the chip company. That was the stock moving to the downside for both the S&P 500 and also for the Nasdaq in session. To what we're seeing on treasuries, and this is the early state of play for the bond market. 2-year yields are lower, 4.03% is what we're watching. Again, data points not exactly soothing over fears about the extent of the slowdown that could be materializing stateside because of the tariff uncertainty. The 10-year, we're 4.29%. The dollar in the context of a weaker yield market, and you can see the sterling is giving back a little bit of territory morning session, but yen euro same story. So it is a story of some dollar strength that is moving on to the charts early on. Dollar yen also firmer territory today. The commodities trade, as we talk about the situation in the Middle East, this is the price action. We are firmer. And you can see that Brent prices around 71.5, WTI around the 68 handle, just shy of that, but 0.5% bounce morning session. Gold, the classic safety trade, and there's still been a ton of appetite for the precious metal. Again, firmer territory through $3,000, as you can see on the boards. That is a gain of about 0.5%. Take a look at the Asian markets. We were mentioning in the headlines of BYD and some of the groundbreaking technology on charging EVs. That stock has soared to a high that is helping out some of the boards across in the Asian markets. If we start at the top, Japanese stocks also firmer. I mentioned the story around Berkshire Hathaway, 1.3% higher for the Tokyo market today. Hong Kong seems to be the port of call for a lot of investors in that region. And again, that market rallying on the tech news. It is much firmer territory, close to 2% higher. The Shanghai Composite only just gliding into firmer territory. And this has been something that's been pointed out, that Hong Kong has been the way to express some of that interest from the Asian investors. The Australian market also very slim territory to the upside. The opening calls. This is the European picture early on. We are chasing a little bit of green, as you can see, particularly for Italian stocks and over across in Germany. Upsides in there on the back of what was, again, another positive session yesterday. The German and Italian stock market seem to be the two leading the charge. A second positive day there yesterday.
When you have two, I don't know, let's call it bull elephants or say butting heads kind of thing, it's hard to see how these two magnificent animals, how anyone's going to give ground, or two magnificent tigers, or two magnificent foes of any description as well. And I kind of feel that way, not when you and I are chatting.
I was going to say, it's not us this time.
No, it's not.
But I'm wondering who the players are.
It's the two schools of thought in the United States of America. One that comes from years of historic and economic analysis saying if you have tariffs, it is the person who imports the goods who pays those tariffs, and they then decide whether to increase the cost to their customers as well. It is not the people who export into that country. That is one side of the argument, who are saying tariffs are paid by the importer, by the consumer. There are others who are in the Trump administration who believe no. It is the exporters selling into the United States who actually pay the cost of these tariffs. And you've got these two, as I say, let's call them bull elephants, butting heads at the moment, and no one is giving ground. Someone is wrong. US retail sales growth came in well short of expectations in February, up 20 basis points after January's contraction was revised to the downside to mark the biggest drop since July 2021. This is the consumer reacting to something. Again, I'm not going to give you value-added judgment on this one. I'm telling you the consumer is very concerned. Economists had penciled in growth of 0.6%. Receipts at food services and drinking places, i.e. a degree of discretion, no? Well, that fell 1.5%. That is the largest drop since January of last year. Got a couple of bits of tape for you that'll just sum this up. The debate, the butting of heads that's going on here as well. The National Retail Federation's Matt Shea attributed some of the blame to Trump's policy blitz.
The uncertainty and the volatility that's taking place right now is causing some softening. And I think that's a real phenomenon, and it's hard for consumers to keep up with what's happening.
This is the other side. The National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett said any revenues from tariffs could be put towards, well, we've talked about this a lot, a tax cut.
I was just looking at the Customs and Border Patrol data for March, for the first week of March. And do you realize that if you run it out over 10 years, the amount of tariff revenue that we've already collected for the actions that we've taken, including some that you just mentioned, adds up to about $1 trillion over 10 years. $1 trillion that we could use to, say, give everybody a tax cut or reduce the deficit. And so that $1 trillion is part of the story.
That man looks so optimistic. And yet, is he ignoring the fact that the consumer, I'm not saying cratering, but the consumer is stunningly worried and doesn't feel like this is a tax cut?
Exactly, and you can see that the consumer is already voting with its feet. Let's get to Jörg Kramer with this, chief economist at Commerzbank. Jörg, there's a huge fascination with how the US consumer is behaving at this stage, and we can see that the inflation expectations have gone up, typically a warning sign for economists. And when it comes to big ticket items, they are staying very cautious. But even on the services side, which has been one of the great areas of spending in recent years, we're seeing somewhat of a fade there. We don't know whether that's just weather or whether this is the consumer saying, look, we are careful because of all the uncertainty now. We want to save our pennies. What do you think?
Well, put it this way. You said either the exporter or the importer. This means the consumer pays for higher tariffs. The theory is clear. Normally, both sides will pay. That means a part of the burden will hit consumers. And therefore, the decline in consumer sentiment in the United States is absolutely in line with economic theory of tariffs.
It's a good point, isn't it, that there is a spread that does encompass the consumer. And the reality is that we're hearing from businesses that they are so concerned now about the executive signings that we've seen, the sweep of a pen by Trump. They don't know what's coming next. And that could have an impact on corporate profit margins, right, which also then impacts hiring intentions. How do we think about whether the US is going to see some sort of economic contraction on the horizon if Trump doesn't pivot from here?
Well, put it this way, you're absolutely right. We see, due to Trump's action, we see a high level of political uncertainty, and uncertainty is bad for corporate investment. This is clear. However, in the end, I do not expect that the US economy will fall into recession because the ground speed of the US economy is quite high. And we should also not forget that Trump is not only a protectionist, but that he's also doing something which is good for the corporate sector. That means less regulation, less bureaucracy, and lower corporate tax. Therefore, yes, his policy will dampen economic activity, but I do not expect an outright recession.
Don't get too optimistic is the message here. But what about on the investment side and on the stock market? Because businesses are already saying, look, how can you invest in an environment like this? And we're concerned that the investment or capex decisions are going to be simply delayed until there's more certainty, as well as the stock market, the wealth effect that we've seen, the destruction that has happened for a lot of even retail traders that have seen big popular stocks fall very aggressively. How do we think about the impact of those catalysts?
Well, as far as a decline in the stock price is concerned, of course, this is a negative wealth effect. However, you have to take an average over many quarters, and we have seen over the past 2-3 years a huge increase in the equity market in the United States. Therefore, there's also a positive wealth effect in the pipeline. That means I would not overestimate this negative impact.
Try telling that to the federal workers, though, Jörg. Okay, Jörg, lovely to see you. I haven't seen you for such a long time. I have so many questions about Germany to ask you as well. And I was fascinated by your German debt delusions piece as well, which say more public debt will not actually change the capacity overall of the economy. Do you want to talk us through a little bit as well? Because I think it's actually fascinating, your premise. And actually, dare I say it, you seem sceptical about the benefits potentially of this historic day at the Bundestag.
Put it this way, I'm absolutely released and optimistic that the Bundestag today will clear the way for more defense spending. I think this is absolutely necessary and good. When it comes, however, to the question whether this will increase the supply side of the economy, you have to understand that more money for infrastructure is not enough. What you also need is less regulation when it comes to the bureaucratic approval procedures for infrastructure investment. And I do not find any sentence on this in the position paper of the Christian Democrat and the Social Democrats. And if you go on, for example, the non-wage costs, which have a lot to do with social security contributions. They are right, they have risen significantly, but the likely future coalition, they do not want to raise the retirement age, and they will continue to subsidize early retirement. Or think of the problem of the high corporate tax in Germany compared to other countries. There's, according to the two parties, the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, there is no priority on a reform on the corporate tax system. Therefore, all in all, why I'm positive and agree to the need for more defense spending, I do not think that the overall package will meaningful increase potential output of the German economy. That means the supply side.
I think you make some absolutely fabulous points, Jürgen. I didn't think that was where you were going to go on this one as well. Look, if Germany can improve productivity by doing what every single of those men and women who have spoken to Karen and myself from the top echelons of German business, from the Mittelstand, from all levels of have said to us, we want this deregulation, we need this deregulation as well. But the good news is the Italians have given us recipes for Germany, whether it's Letta, whether it's Draghi, whether, dare I say it, it's Orcel. And I know you don't want to talk about the latter, of course. The fact of the matter is there is a recipe out there as well. Surely Herr Merz is going to sign up to that as well.
Yeah, this is clear. This is we do not have an intellectual problem. Everybody knows what to do. However, the political system in Germany is not ready to tell the people what needs to be done, because reforms also need some pain. Think of the acceleration of approval procedures. This means that the environmental organization would have less influence on infrastructure projects, and this is not appreciated by all political parties. And in the end, you have to understand that in Germany, the far right and the far left, they represent now more than 1/3 of the seats in the parliament, and therefore the traditional parties are forced to work together. However, the position of the traditional parties, Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, they differ a lot, and they try to gloss over this by simply more debt and more money. But more money cannot solve each and every problem.
Absolutely excellent point there again, Jürgen. That the point is this Bundestag, it ends very soon. That is why Herr Merz and indeed the SPD are getting this through quickly on the defence spending and the fiscal. Are you saying then that actually, given those the 2/3 isn't going to be there in the new Bundestag, that actually swift, affirmative, aggressive action on the deregulation or deregulation of Germany isn't going to happen, and they're going to be blocked at every turn by the AfD and the left?
Well, this is not blocked by the AfD and the left as far as supply side reforms is concerned. The problem is that the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, they do not have a common understanding how to improve the competitive side of the German economy, and therefore they do not have a coherent economic policy, and therefore I do not expect in my main scenario that we get the necessary significant improvement of the supply side of the German economy.
Jörg, thank you very much for joining us today. Big day for Germany. Jörg Kramer, Chief Economist at Commerzbank. For all the market action as we look ahead to Germany's key debt brake vote, you can check out our live blog on CNBC.com. Coming up on the show, global growth is expected to slow further this year and next, according to the OECD. We'll take a closer look at which countries will likely bear the brunt of US tariffs. Plus, it's crunch time in Germany as lawmakers prepare to vote on a historic debt brake reform. More later this hour. And we'll discuss the state of European banking with the CEO of CaixaBank. Don't miss our exclusive interview at 7:30 GMT. US President Donald Trump said his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping will visit the US in the not-too-distant future. However, the White House did not clarify whether the two sides agreed to hold a summit. Trump's comments come after the US government imposed a 20% tariff on imports from China, prompting Beijing to respond with levies on roughly $22 billion in US goods. The OECD warned that President Trump's tariffs are likely to weigh on growth in Canada, Mexico and the US, with American households bearing the brunt of the new import taxes. In its latest report, the OECD projects global growth will slow 10 basis points to 3.1% this year, while US growth forecasts have also been cut, now seen at 2.2% in 2025 and losing further steam ahead. Sylvia joins us with more. Sylvia, our last guest was saying don't get too pessimistic on what we're just hearing out of the US, and that there's still more to come when it is around regulation and tax changes. But the data so far that we're hearing on tariffs does sum it up, suggesting this is net negative for the United States.
And that's the message from the OECD. In a very diplomatic way, they are saying we're expecting lower economic growth for the global economy. And the reason behind that, the main reason behind that, is the trade uncertainty. And they are indeed highlighting the tariffs that the United States has imposed on Canada, Mexico, China, as well as the European Union. Their message is that these tariffs, they consider them significant changes in trade policy, and therefore, if sustained, they will hit global growth and raise inflation. Here's the Secretary General of the OECD with their latest assessment.
Well, there's been a softening in growth. That's what's shown through the data in the back of, in particular, recent trade tensions, recent developments when it comes to uncertainty around trade policy settings in particular, which has had an impact on business confidence and is seen as having potential implications for investment and consumption moving forward.
So are you saying that the biggest reason behind lower economic growth is the trade tariffs announced by Donald Trump?
Well, there's a very significant level of uncertainty right now, and it is clear that the global economy would benefit from increases in certainty when it comes to the trade policy settings.
The president, however, has said that this is going to perhaps bring some economic pain in the short term, but in the long term, this would benefit the U.S. economy. Do you agree with his remarks?
Well, obviously, in the meantime, there's going to be a very significant impact in markets all around the world and on the global economic growth outlook. I mean, and in particular, when you look at what's happening in countries like Canada and Mexico, who have a very significant level of trade exposure, and in particular trade exposure to the United States, the implications are potentially, very significant. And in the U.S. as well, what we see is that the sort of policy measures being pursued at the moment are likely to lead to increases in production costs as well as costs of consumption. So lower global growth and higher inflation will also have flow-on consequences in the United States.
And speaking of the United States, in the economic outlook, you're actually suggesting that growth will slow down also in the U.S. economy. 2.2% in 25 and 1.6% for 2026. Do you have any estimates, any ideas of where U.S. economic growth could be if these trade tariffs had not been announced?
Well, we're indicating that, by way of upside risk, if those measures were reversed, it would certainly have a positive impact on global growth and hence on growth in the United States. And, in particular, even have a stronger impact in countries like Mexico and Canada.
So there you have the Matthias Cormann, Secretary General of the OECD, being very clear really with their message around what to expect from the global economy. And they are indeed downbeat in terms of what to expect from the US economy. I'll just make one final point regarding the Eurozone. Now, looking at the numbers from the OECD, they expect a global growth for the Eurozone at 1% in 2025, 1.2% in 2026. These numbers are actually better than the number for 2024. So we are seeing a little bit of an improvement for the Eurozone compared to what happened in 2024. However, though, they are still highlighting, of course, that these trade tensions could have ramifications for the euro area. And finally, I asked him about the defense spending, and he made the point that actually when you think about what that means for the euro area, that is a positive economic development despite what we saw in bond markets.
As we've discussed on this channel many times over the years, through our international relations studies, which we've all done, big organisations, big countries very often benefit from bilateral trade, whereas actually smaller nations benefit from multilateral because, of course, the collection of parties working on the same message often actually negates the power of the bigger power. In this situation, the US is trying to basically pick off enemies or pick off allies or whatever you want to call them one by one, whether it's the EU, whether it's the UK, whether it's the Chinese, whether it's the Mexicans, whether it's the Canadians. Mark Carney has just had, in his first 4 days, 2 trips all around the world. And basically, he's speaking to the Europeans, he's speaking to the British, he's speaking to the French separately, who are Europeans, and maybe even speaking to the Mexicans at some stage. If there is a coalition of the willing, to take a phrase from the Ukraine story as well, and actually nations get together to face down the threat of the United States, that makes them stunningly more powerful against Donald Trump.
Absolutely, and that will also revive a lot of the international cooperation and organizations, which is actually the message from the OECD. But ultimately, let's see whether that's going to happen, because the pressure right now is on all of these countries. Let's see if they can actually work together and to some extent mitigate the impact of these trade tariffs announced by the White House.
Yeah, okay, well, let's move on. Thank you very much indeed. Very interesting speaking.
Thank you for listening to Squawk Box Europe Express.
For more market-moving news, you can head to CNBC.com.
Or join us again on the show with Steve Sedgwick, Karen Cho, and myself, Arabi Lekumete, weekdays on CNBC.